Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us for Stand with the Facts. I'm Kim Malcolm, the local host of KUOW's All Things Considered. Together with the Center for an Informed Public, our goal is to empower you, our audience, to be informed news consumers and voters. We hope these panels will help anyone watching know how to spot and stop misinformation from spreading as we head into this 2020 election. We do have a toolkit for you on how to spot misinformation and combat it in our daily lives. More details on that in the link to this episode. And we're also taking your questions. If you are watching live, please leave them in the comments and I will get to as many as I can. As I speak, we are 21 days away from Election Day, and there is a lot of mis and disinformation circulating around this election, creating fear and confusion for voters. The potential impact of voters of color is growing. They are gaining in their share of the electorate compared to whites, who have dropped 9 points in their share of eligible voters in Washington state in the last 20 years. Research shows that Black and brown voters, as well as other minority groups, are being targeted with disinformation in an effort to discourage or splinter voter turnout. I'd like to welcome our guests now who we have here to explore who's behind this effort and what's being done about it. Joining me is Michelle Merriweather, President and CEO of the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle, Oskar Zambrano, Director of Civic Engagement and Advocacy at the Latino Community Fund, and Mike Caulfield, a digital information literacy expert working at Washington State University in Vancouver. He's worked with various organizations on digital literacy initiatives. Michelle, Oskar, Mike, welcome to you all.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Thank you, Kim.
Thank you. It's great to see you. So, Mike Caulfield, if I can start with you just to get us the big picture. When we say disinformation is targeting people of color in this election cycle, what does that actually look like? What are you seeing with your work for this with the Center for an Informed Public?
Well, this is not a new thing. So just to be clear, it happened in 2016. It's happened before, and marginalized communities are often the target of misinformation, disinformation for various reasons, which we can discuss. But when you talk about targeting, when you're talking about actual disinformation targeting, you're talking about the infiltration of various groups online to push various narratives. You're talking about particular pieces, whether they be memes that are circulated, whether they be certain narratives that are honed, that are specifically designed to influence those populations. And so right now it's a little harder to say, I think, what's going on, but we have a clear idea, or a somewhat clear idea, of what happened in 2016. And in 2016, we saw all of those things, right? We saw the infiltration of groups associated with marginalized populations. We saw the creation of a lot of material, a lot of it was memes, right? A lot of it was memes, this idea trying to build up a lack of trust or trying to maybe capitalize and expand on a lack of trust that marginalized populations have with institutions, in that case, the Democratic Party. And then, yeah, we're looking at that more broadly. And I think there's really two things that go on. One is very intentional, and that's disinformation. That's very hard to attribute in the moment. It's very hard to know that this is explicitly being done by these people, to these people. But misinformation, the broader issue, yeah, we can see that, and that's going on as we speak.
And Mike, just briefly, when you say it's hard to know exactly what's going on right now, is that just because there's just so much and it's happening so quickly right now that you don't have the distance to look at it? Or
more along the lines of attribution. So attribution of who is doing what, and whether it is sort of part of an intentional broad campaign, or whether it is something that is a mixture of organic and bad actors or something like that. That's very difficult to do in the moment. Attribution is a process we saw after the 2016 election. It took quite a bit of time to start to really conclusively attribute some of the things we saw explicitly in that case to the Internet Research Agency in Russia, right?
In Russia.
So attribution is hard. The patterns are maybe visible in the moment, but knowing how coordinated that is something that we have to be careful about in the moment.
Michelle, if I can turn to you, I know that the Black community, African Americans, they are among the top consumers of social media. That's from a Nielsen study just a couple of years ago. A lot of election information gets shared, of course, on social media, and the quality of that, as we know, varies widely. And I'm curious how you are seeing people right now online, how engaged they are with the election at this point.
Extremely. I mean, I think for one, news spreads so fast these days, especially on social media. Nowadays, especially our young people, that's the first place they get their information, right? So it's a tweet, a share, a retweet, etc. It happens at the speed of light, whether or not it's accurate or not. It gets shared quickly. If it captures your attention, that's why those memes are so important. If it captures your attention, it's shared quickly. And so good or bad, right or wrong, there is an extensive amount of activity on social media right now, especially within young people and young people of color, primarily the Black community.
And sorry, how about older folks as well?
Oh, yes. Yeah. I mean, I don't know where I come in, but my demographic is certainly extremely engaged. I believe we've always been engaged, but more so right now because there's so much at stake with this election for us. And so, you know, my parents' generation and older, they're just now getting acclimated to social media. And so it's new for them. And so I do find a lot of the misinformation being shared more by them than like my demographic and younger. And that's just, I don't, you know, Mike would have to share the data and the details, but I've noticed that with like my family and friends of like my parents' generation, I'll get something from them and I'm like, that's not accurate, check the website, you know.
Right.
But it's definitely an engaged community online with this election more than ever before.
Right. Oskar, we also know that Hispanic and Latino communities are heavier users of Facebook and YouTube than the overall population. Does this line up with what you're seeing with the communities that you work with?
Yeah, you know, a lot of people in our community do rely on those two social media platforms. What we've seen a lot lately in the past, even 4 years, is an uptake on YouTubers that call themselves media outlets or news outlets that are not trained, you know, journalists. They don't have necessarily any code of ethics, and they don't have any, you know, formal training as to how to decipher truth from fiction, right? And when it comes to reporting, a lot of it has to do with culturally. Also, some of these YouTubers use culturally relevant language and methods to attract audiences, and for them, you know, the interest is the click and getting the audience up, you know, increase versus actually reporting information that is accurate and that can be trusted. Through the last couple of years, we have seen, you know, people retweeting or sharing again some of those memes. I think memes are pretty big also in our community. You know, and there's no questioning, there's no like authority that can say, you know, that is actually false. Until recently, that now Twitter and some other platforms are doing, you know, some checks on factual information. But even then, I think the misinformation that, you know, targeted last cycle, especially in the African American community, is now also targeting the Latino community with a lot of these same tactics and tools, but also using more of that narrative that is hard lining alt-right in a sense, by suspending all knowledge, all, you know, understanding of your own consciousness, and then putting it into an identity for nationalism and patriotism. And so some of these things have come mostly from social media, not from conversations on the ground or conversations people have had, but it's mostly all been influenced by social media, especially YouTube and Facebook.
Interesting. And then, of course, that raises the question, as Mike was saying about attribution, where is that actually coming from? Can you tell us a little bit about some of the main issues in this election that are getting a lot of traction in the communities? I'm thinking of COVID-19, but I'm sure there are plenty others. Tell me what's really getting people talking right now. Michelle?
Absolutely, COVID-19. I also think that there's been a tremendous amount of interest in Senate races in particular communities, uh, which is more than ever before that I have noticed more than ever before. COVID specifically, the Affordable Care Act and how that may play in the next 4 years, because it is important to our community to have health care. Um, Education, of course, is also a big deal because so many young people, especially in marginalized communities, have been disconnected from education, again, due to COVID. And then, of course, the fear tactics and things that are coming from the White House have certainly have played a huge part in the conversations and the things that we've been seeing and have been engaged in, and the National Urban League having to push against. So, I mean, every day is something different. And then I'll also add that in places like Georgia and Texas, where um, voting has started yesterday and the day before, uh, how um, how people are responding, how long the lines are, that people want to vote and want to vote early, and then they're still being disenfranchised and marginalized and not able to express their right to vote easily.
Um, just following up on that, I know that there has been a fear of violence that could erupt at polling places. And those fears have been stoked in the last couple of weeks. I know one phrase that was making the rounds was that of President Trump during the debate, suggesting that his followers go and watch, quote unquote, these polling places, which technically you can't actually enter in most states. They've got rules around that. Are you seeing an effect from that, or what kind of response was there with that kind of
Yeah, I mean, I think
statement?
the fear is still certainly there. I think the people that we've been connected with and in touch with throughout the country, because there's 90 urban leagues throughout the country, in those places, the encouragement is just to vote early, because I believe in, again, others that have more data that are closer to it know better, but those type of things will happen closer to election day, and the fear will get greater. If we are encouraging people to make a plan and vote early, be it absentee, be it in person, whatever is available in their community, um, to help uh, you know save off some of that fear. But it's still real and it's still relevant, and we just have to be prepared to answer that with truth and honesty and support for those that are showing up to the polls to vote, to exercise their right to vote.
Oskar, much the same question to you. What are the issues that's really sparked among people and in the communities that you're working with?
Yeah, sorry. I think there's that national conversation, but I think it's the local, and I really want to, for me, for this question, answer more on the local level,
Please.
within Washington State as well, because I think there's a lot of like, oh yeah, Washington is progressive, we're good here, we have a great system that's successful, but what we're seeing in, like, you go to Yakima County, you go to Grant County, Adams County, Chelan, Douglas, I can go down the middle of the state, and you will see some of these tactics. Look at the governor, who's running for governor right now, CUOW, that is basically going against the restrictions of COVID safety that the governor and health agencies have posted. Some of that misinformation has gone there as well, where they're like, it was this virus, not, you know, a real virus, but it was coming from China, all these things, right? And so I think a lot of those issues creates a lot of confusion. And I think what we're seeing, you know, in Central Washington and throughout Washington is the fact that people are trying to find a reliable resource for information because they care about healthcare. I mean, I think Michelle hit the nail right on the head with all these issues. Healthcare is a major issue. We had wildfires. You know, how do people understand the wildfires, you know, are important with environmental justice? You know, I live here in Seattle, and I work closely with partners here in the Puget Sound area, and so they didn't know about the fires until the smoke got here, right? So I think there's a lot of these issues that are pretty front and center that are impacting communities of color, but there's so much misinformation and there's so much, like, you know, noise on both ends that, you know, people are trying to figure out what is true, what is fact, and who do I believe and who do I trust, right? And so I think that you know, Washington State, like the issue that Michelle brought up, you know, about like possible law enforcement and going to these places. We have like Yakima County that did the officer of the auditors is inside the courthouse as well in Chelan County. So, and actually in Wenatchee, you know, you have it right across from the Office of Immigration, you know, and ICE, in other words. So a lot of these communities, yeah, live, you know, they're highly density immigrant communities, highly density Latino communities, but they're surrounded by these institutions that they fear or that don't trust. And so when you put a ballot box right in front of the doorstep of ICE or right in the front of the doorstep of a courthouse, you know, what is the message that you're sending? In Yakima, you have to go through a checkpoint in order to get to the auditor's office to fill out your ballot or to register to vote. So these are, like, you know, other barriers that we're saying in Washington State is not happening. It is happening right now, that there are still barriers in different counties that tend to lean more conservative or tend to be more, you know, prone to not support the immigrant community as much. And so these issues are still front and center in Washington State, even though we're not talking about them necessarily, but it is happening here. And so that's where, you know, our commitment is to support the community and break down those barriers.
Is there a particular piece or meme, misinformation or disinformation that's been circulating in the last little while that in particular strikes you as really quite egregious, that would, you know, as an example of what people are dealing with? Oskar, that question was for you. Sorry. Yeah, no worries.
Yeah, at the top of my head, I think it's the use of wedge issues, you know, like abortion, like Second Amendment rights, you know, healthcare, immigration. These, I think it's a collection of memes or a collection of those online posts that are used to divide people. And actually, in the immigrant community, is to invoke fear to not vote, or invoke fear not to go submit their ballot, invoke fear, you know, and also that, you know, you're wasting your vote. You shouldn't vote because nothing's going to change. And I think those are some of the memes and the messages that I've seen mostly on social media, where it says, you know, I come from a country, an immigrant country, and nothing changed here. Why are things going to change here too, right? And so that's like a really hard, you know, mountain to climb as an organizer and a community member, that you're trying to educate people that actually it does matter here, and that, you know, there are barriers that have been diminished in Washington State and in other parts of the country to make sure that their voices are counted. I think the Pew researchers just you know, came out the other day saying that over 60% of Latinos are not even being contacted by any campaign or any organization or any other way of giving them information, right? And that's always been one of the problems on the progressive side and the Republican side, that, you know, they discount totally a community that, you know, has right now one of the largest non-white voting blocks in the country. And so they, you know, to in essence, by keeping them not voting, it's actually better for certain people to not vote, versus actually reaching out to them and having conversations, having in-language information. And I think that's where these memes and all these, you know, misinformation comes in, where there's a vacuum to be filled, right? And because there's no information for this 60% of voters, now somebody, a meme or someone, can just put out other information and they will believe it's true because it's funny, it's culturally relevant, they connect to it, and they will
and it's there.
Yeah.
Yeah. I do want to reach out to our audience and to remind you that we do want to hear from you. So if you've got some questions for our guests, please let us know. Just leave them in the comments and I will get to as many of them as I can. Well, as Oskar was bringing up, Mike, these efforts around voter suppression. I'm curious what you're seeing specifically when it comes to discouraging voters of color, to make them fearful or just question, raises enough questions that people will not follow through with the intention of perhaps checking into voting.
Well, one thing that we're actually worried about now is this sort of a double-edged sword around addressing or talking about potential actions of white supremacists at the polls, militia at the polls, in the way that can be used to also suppress the vote. So we just put out a rapid response paper with the Electoral Integrity Project, looking at this question of, on the one hand, to the extent that there are threats at the polls, you want to have a public conversation about that. You want to have that addressed. You want to raise awareness about that. On the other hand, if you're starting to raise awareness to a level where people are imagining there are going to be threats at their local polling place at a level that might not be there, that actually might have a broader, more suppressive effect than the actual actions themselves. And so you get into this very difficult situation. And you can make an argument that to some extent, the entire provocation, the announcement of these various things is part of sort of a disturbing game that creates a dynamic where a lot of people might unintentionally amplify fears that might be unfounded and might lead to a broad suppressive effect. And again, I'm not saying that it's sort of a calculus that you've got to make in each locality, in each with each issue. But it's certainly the case that one of the things I expect to happen on election day is there's going to be a whole bunch of video, images, things like that, zipping around that may show disturbing things going on at the polls. And some of those will be true, and some will be false, and some may be crimes, right? And some may be, of course, fabricated. And if it creates a broad impression that going to the polls in a locality where it would be safe to go to the polls is unsafe, that could have implications.
But to what extent are we insulated to a degree by that, from the fact that here in Washington State we vote by mail in the safety and security of our own homes?
In Washington State, so obviously in Washington State we have a situation where we're insulated from that. That is true. And so in Washington State, I don't necessarily know that will be the issue. There are other sorts of misinformation, though, regarding, say, penalties for a person that inadvertently commits some sort of action in regards to their ballot, right? Or the fact if you file a ballot, one of the ways that the vote has been suppressed in other places is the idea that, oh, if you file this ballot, then creditors will find you, or some other sort of action will be triggered. So there are sort of broad suppressive effects like that. But you're right. I've been thinking about the national picture. In Washington State, we are a bit more isolated from that. But I think probably Oskar and Michelle could speak more to that and some of the fears that get stoked in these communities, even in a vote by mail state like ours.
Yeah, Oskar, thank you for bringing up the issue of the drop boxes and where they're physically positioned and the message perhaps that sends to some people. Michelle, what kind of questions pop up in your mind when you hear that, when it comes about mail-in voting and whether or not that makes people feel more secure in sending in their ballot?
Yeah, I think for me, the things that come up are certainly the things that Oskar mentioned and locations of the drop boxes, right? People who do not trust systems, but certainly want to exercise their right to vote, and it's right in front of City Hall or other places where they don't feel comfortable going. But other than that, I think of signatures having to match. You know, I've heard some things like if your signature isn't exactly like your registration form, your ballot is thrown out. And if you know one thing is missing from, or one thing is not, one box is not checked, etc., you know, your ballot is thrown out completely. And so people are just leery of that. Other than that, again, in Washington, we're pretty insulated from a lot of those particular fears. Um, but the Dropbox places are certainly valid.
And I'll just throw out there for what it's worth. I know that in Washington State, if there is a question about your ballot, if it's not clear, if the information is not lining up, they will give you a call or email you with the email that you provide. Can we talk a little bit about the role that social media companies are playing here with communities of color? I know that there was a researcher at Equus Labs who found that in some cases, the disinformation on English language Facebook pages were getting flagged, but the same material was not being flagged sometimes on Spanish pages. And Oskar, I'm wondering if you've heard about that, if that's a concern for you.
Yeah, it is. But also I want to real quickly talk about the installation problem in Washington.
Sure.
I think there is that there, yes, we are. But also I think that, you know, if you go to central Washington and in very conservative, you know, where like Trump country of Washington state, because like I said, Washington is very diverse. You will see, so we are actually going to be putting observers, voting observers at auditor's office in key parts of the state, because we know that there's a fear for that community, especially communities of color, tend to register late, tend to vote late on elections. And so if you lost your ballot, or you need a ballot replacement, or it never got there, you can request one. But because the tendencies to vote late is that you have to go to the auditor's office or another polling place under the new Washington Voter Rights Act and the voter access bills that were passed 2 years ago. So we are actually trying to alleviate that by putting volunteer observers in some of the auditor's office and polling places that you have to go in person, right? Because we know that we saw a white supremacy stronghold at the governor's office, Capitol this year during COVID, and we saw that in other parts of the state, that they are in corners with handguns. You know, Ellensburg is one of them. You know, where they are patrolling. These so-called militias from local cities to uphold their constitutional rights or whatever that the candidate Culp is also supporting. So we are. I don't think we're completely not excluded from that concept, because I think there are parts of the state that are still in that category. As far as the social media, yes, I think you're right that there's a lot of content that again, there aren't many resources for people that are non-English speakers to actually know what is true from fiction. There are very limited, I think, like national TV stations, there are two, Telemundo and Univision, right? There aren't many newspapers that are focusing on content and education to the community. So I think that's where like Latino Community Fund and other organizations that are Spanish speaking were able to fill some of that, but the hole is really huge, right? For us to like fill that void. But we are doing trainings, we are educating community members as to what is fact or fiction. We do have a hotline where people can call in and ask us information about voting, because we want to make sure that we create platforms, and also through WhatsApp, we have community groups that have formed to share information, and that's as moderators, we're able to like also flag some of that information. But it's really difficult to do that full time.
Well, yeah, I was just about to ask. I mean, are you getting calls on the hotline? I mean, how much work is being poured into the WhatsApp to fight the disinformation?
Yeah, so what we in some ways of addressing it, I know probably you're getting there, but we're working with the Washington Sense Alliance community partners that we were physically sponsoring to basically show them, what is the election process. We've been educating them through the census. Now we're at the next logical step of civic engagement, which is now we need to educate people on voting. So through that platform, we're able to bring community members into this next phase to educate them of what the process is, and also when they get questions, if they know how to answer them, they can. But if not, they can call us to get those questions answered. So we're still doing the trusted messenger model, even with election work, because that is where you break through the ice in some of this misinformation. And we have like the hotline we have Facebook, all these other platforms where people can message us, and we are getting messages about like, who do I vote for? What is this election? So we are going to be doing trainings in the next couple of days to address some of those issues, for a larger audience. But we are getting one-on-ones also to help people break through this problem.
And I'm glad you brought up the concept of the trusted messenger model, which not all of our audience members may be familiar with. And it also takes me back to, Mike, it was one of the things you said in your very first answer to one of my questions, trust. Tell me about trust, relationships, and the importance of that in trying to break through the mis and disinformation right here. The trusted messenger model, just break it down for us really quickly.
So particularly when you think about marginalized populations, there's two issues going on that make marginalized populations particularly susceptible, right? And one is just a broad level of very well motivated institutional distrust, right? And so, for example, you'll find larger percentages of the Black community will believe that AIDS was a government-created pandemic, right? But of course, this is a community that knows about Tuskegee, right? So you have a really motivated institutional distrust that is easy for bad actors to play with. But the other issue is just the media ecosystem. And one of the things that makes different populations more vulnerable to misinformation is just there's not the funding for a media ecosystem really from their community, really from their culture. And so when you find those sorts of gaps, right? When you find those sorts of gaps, but there's not a trusted messenger because there is not a well-funded news operation from that specific community for that specific place, then you're kind of thrown into this alternative media ecosystem, which can serve that purpose. It absolutely can, but without something that's really rooted in ethical journalism, without something with the funding to do real stories, then it's a little difficult to navigate the information environment without some of those real trusted sources coming out of the communities. And there's very real impacts. I mean, I think of indigenous populations said for years, reporters are not covering the number of women going missing from our communities, right? It was just not covered by the media. And so of course,
it wasn't even being collected into state
right?
databases, yeah.
And so when you have a situation like that, when someone sees something from some random blog that makes another similar credible claim, then where do they go to check that out? If they know that their issues are not being covered, within sort of more traditional institutions, where do they go for the news to find out, well, is this true? Is this false? Where is their trusted source? And so ultimately, I think one of the big lessons of this all is that we need to really fund those sources, or otherwise we're kind of putting band-aids on a problem that needs a more systemic solution.
Well, Michelle, I'm hoping you can pick up on that thread then with your organization, with the Urban League and others that you're in partnership with. What are organizations doing to address disinformation this season? And please also feel free to riff on the theme of trust, which I would like to hear a lot more about.
Definitely. As Oskar stated, throughout the census, we actually galvanized and funded trusted messengers within the community to go out and spread the factual information about completing the census. And we're doing the same thing with voting, right? We created a pamphlet about being a first-time voter and what that looks like, how to get educated on your local ballot, how to read your local ballot, where to go when you have a question. Our website has information on where you can check to see if you're registered to vote, and if you're not, where to go to register, where to go, where your ballot drop boxes are, et cetera. So we are one, galvanizing on the ground folks in community, from community, that look like the community, to be trusted messengers of that information. We also have campaigns on social media, of course, because again, that's where people go to get their information first. We just make sure that it is timely, accurate information, and we also try to combat the false narratives that are out there as well, as best as we can. As we always, know that the false information travels way faster than the truth, unfortunately. So we try to address that as best as we can. But again, it goes back to, who do I trust? And it's your cousin, brother, best friend, etc. So we're making sure that your cousin, brother, best friend, etc., is armed with the accurate information. And so we're, like Oskar said, carrying on that trusted messenger model that worked very well for the census. And we're going to carry that through various things, not only voter registration and engagement, but then redistricting, et cetera, and carrying that model on as much as we can to make sure that people on the ground are armed with the truth.
Michelle, are you able to gauge the impact of your efforts? Are you getting a sense that it is making a difference, that it is having an influence?
Well, we hope so. We're certainly encouraged to see the amount of young people that are engaged in the election this year, and how empowered they feel. And I'm sure that has a lot to do with their frustration with the systems that have failed them over the last over the course of their lifetime. To be honest, and the things that they have seen over the last 3 or 4 years that they're just tired and frustrated with, which largely led to the massive protest and engagement of the streets, which were led by a tremendous amount of young people and young voices. And so I think, yes, they are, people in their teens and 20s are the most disengaged voter bloc. And if we engage them, we can change systems. And so I believe that the things that they are hearing, both negative and positive, are kind of electrifying them and encouraging them, and they are not going to take it anymore, right? Just like we have seen in the work that they have done in the last few months. And so I think yes, and that could just be my hopeless optimism showing, but I do believe that it's working. We'll certainly see once people start voting, and definitely November 3rd and beyond. But I think that it's making a difference.
I do want to get to a couple of audience questions before our time comes to an end. So let me just pull one up here. This comes from Marcia, who's on YouTube right now, and she writes, I hear all the time that Black and Latino communities feel they are being taken as a given by the Democratic Party. Is this true or false? So not specifically about misinformation, but perhaps more about the environment that's already there to be exploited. Oskar, can I ask you to start on that?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big, also misinformation has been playing a role there, because there has been that sentiment for many years, especially with immigrant communities, that the Democratic Party has taken that vote for granted. Again, there's still 60% of like the Latino vote out there that hasn't been even tapped by any campaign. In a traditional campaign, Republican or Democrat, they go to the mid-high propensity voters because they know that those are the most reliable voters to come out and vote, right? Well, that tends to be a white electorate, not a diverse electorate. And so when you consistently go to the same cookie jar and you have a whole bag of cookies on the other side and you're not tapping into that, that's a huge disservice. And they, those cookies eventually will go rotten, and I use that metaphor because I think people need to understand that these communities, BIPOC communities, POC communities, we have been always there. Now like the science and the numbers are like, oh wow, like new voters. No, we have always been there. It's just nobody's talking to us. Nobody has invested in our communities to actually have a conversation and ask us, what do you care about? What do you want? How do you want government to work for you? And so I think that it's on the Republican and the Democrat side. And I think the Democrats have done a better job at including us, but also I think what is missing is a sustainable retainment of that engagement, because usually during election season, all this money is pushed into communities of color, but then they don't leave any organizers behind. They don't leave any infrastructure behind to continue that engagement until the next election, to build out new leaders, to build out new infrastructure, to build out anything in those communities that builds out leaders, PCOs or anything else to really be reflective of the community and have input at the national conventions or at the county parties, right? So I think that there has been some work done, but it's not enough. And I think we need to do more. And I think that has led to frustration from some of like people in my community to be like, see, I've always voted Democratic. And now, the misinformation has fed into that. And now they're voting Republican, or they're voting for a third party, because they feel like they haven't been really, taken care of, in essence, to like really invest in them in voting or any other information tools. And so now they're trying to look for alternatives. And so I think that is the fact. And I think I'm the first one to say, as someone that has worked on, multiple Democratic parties and some Republican parties, is that there hasn't been quite the investment needs to get done on both sides.
Michelle, same question to you, although I will add the caveat that James Clyburn may have he did in fact single-handedly rescue Joe Biden's candidacy, and that's where we are right now. Of course, the great legislator from the Carolinas. So please go ahead. Please talk about the narrative of being taken for granted.
Yeah, it is for the Black community. It's absolutely true for the Democratic Party. I think they are starting to realize it. Hence, Kamala Harris as the vice presidential nominee, and the tremendous impact and interest that has galvanized around the support of her. And the fact that in the last presidential election, over 90% of Black women voted for the other candidate. And we see where we are. So you see the memes and the social media calling to trust Black women, right? And the fact that, and listen to Black women, the fact that I think in multiple elections, Black women have selected the candidate, right? And so I think that it's true. Not enough has been done by either party to galvanize and mobilize this important voter base. And so I think Black women in particular have said, okay, you're not going to listen to us. We're going to take it into our own hands. And we are the keeper of our community, and we're going to educate our community and support and uplift our communities the best way we know how, and have been for hundreds of years. And so that's why you see the support of Kamala Harris, a historically Black college graduate, a member of historically Black Greek letter organization, et cetera. But if either party would, as Oskar mentioned, make that investment in galvanizing and training up future leaders in their party, you would see the following that would come with that, and the engagement like we had in 2008 with Barack Obama. We showed that it can happen, right? And I think that if we do the right things, it can happen again.
Well, that brings me to our last question here, which was sent in by Carol on YouTube. And it's pretty simple, straightforward. How can we help? And I will direct that to, well, actually, you know what, Mike? I'm going to just a quick round robin, because I know we're running out of time. Mike, when it comes to misinformation, disinformation being directed at communities of color, what is it that just a single individual person can do?
Well, I mean, so we have a model, as you know, that's called SIFT, right? It's to stop, investigate the source, find other coverage, and trace claims, quotes, and media to the original context. And that's a model of how to think about this. I mean, what I would say is, at least for what we're going to see over the next few weeks, don't share something where you don't know who the source is or that's not tied to something that you trust, you explicitly trust. Be very careful about sharing anything where you're not aware of where it was, if there's an image, where was it taken, right? When was it taken? Like, you should know the time and location of the things that you're sharing. And if you see other misinformation, a lot of people have the wrong impression that it's about arguing with the person that shared it. It's really not. If you see other misinformation circulating, get in the comments of that person and leave a note, not really for that person, but for the other people that might be viewing what that person posted. Usually it's just a line. You just say, hey, actually, it turns out this isn't true, and then give a link. Do not engage in an argument, but help serve that audience. And one final thing, people underutilize the reporting function on Facebook, right? If material is clearly false, if it is targeted, if it's targeted against any protected groups, you can report that. And maybe that's the best option for you as well. Just go up, click the button, do the drop down, report that content, try to get that taken down if it falls into one of those particularly dangerous categories. But please don't waste your time with a whole bunch of back and forth. Your goal has to be on the audience of that potential misinformation.
Advice we've heard before and will continue to repeat because it is good advice. Oskar, Michelle, any last thoughts on how people can help when it comes to mis and disinformation right now? Michelle.
For me, it's just like I said, false information spreads faster than the truth. So let's end that. Let's end that narrative and start sharing the truth. Like, sharing good, positive information, encouraging people to vote. If you're voting, let people know so they can follow you, so your followers can follow you. Take 5 people to drop off their ballot, and then encourage them to do the same. Let's just start, overwhelming sense of positivity to change the narrative. I'm tired of it.
You are so not alone. Oskar, last thoughts from you.
Well, I think, something that I'm a big believer is in dialogue. And I think Mike, Michelle are talking about this, is that there is fake news or fake information out there. And I think having that conversation either through reporting it, posting it, making some note. But I personally, I think that we're in a cancel culture that really cancels everything out if it's not within your echo chamber. And I think that we need to have those conversations, positive, good conversations, because there's so much negativity out there. And I think, like, if we keep promulgating that, we're part of the problem, not a solution, right? And so I think still having those conversations with your parents, having those conversations in face within your COVID pod, I call them, and friends, give them, I've been writing postcards to some of my friends and families, just saying, hey, this is like a link that you can go to information, because I think it goes back to that trust factor. Is that if you show someone, hey, this is a source I trust, or this is like an organization I trust, they will be more inclined to listen to that, right? Especially coming from someone they trust as well. So I think, keep the conversation open. I think we're in a time that people tend to just not talk to each other anymore and cancel each other out if you don't agree with their political views. I think this is a time where we should be talking more. We should be having more conversations, and positive ones too, not attacking each other, but actually having conversations that are, going to open someone's mind to a perspective they may not know of. So I think that, to me, is get involved, register to vote, fill out your census. You still have time before the end of the month, and volunteer. Some of these organizations, we're doing phone banks from home, remote phone banking, text banking. We're doing, seminars. If you're an expert in any of these fields, come and reach out to some of our organizations that are on the ground working with people. And so just volunteer. I know voting is important, but if you can convince 10 other people to vote, you also had accumulated and amplify your voice to make that change.
Oskar, Michelle, Mike, it's been such a great conversation. A note of optimism. Thank you so much. This has been a topic that's been preoccupying and worrying many of us. So thank you all so much for being here today.
Thank you for inviting us.
Thank you.
Our pleasure. Michelle Merriweather is the president and CEO of the Urban League of Metropolitan Seattle. Oskar Zambrano is the director of civic engagement and advocacy with the Latino Community Fund. And Mike Caulfield is the director of blended and networked learning at WSU Vancouver. Again, folks, thank you all so much. Well, from everyone at KUOW and our partner, the Center for an Informed Public, thank you very much for joining us here with Stand with the Facts. You can visit kuow.org/facts to access the toolkit with links and resources on spotting misinformation and how to address it. And if you're watching on YouTube, you can subscribe to our channel below. Also, a reminder, during this busy election news cycle, you can find new KUOW and NPR stories on the KUOW Newsroom podcast. Jump in whenever you're ready to listen, or pick or skip whatever stories you want. Or you can take 10 minutes to get caught up on the local news of the day with KUOW's Seattle Now podcast, wherever you get your podcasts. You can find out about KUOW's other election-related events at kuow.org/events. Thank you all so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.